So not only is China not absorbing nicely into the global market economy system, but as we learned in episode 187, it's also issuing fat loans to countries and taking control of those countries' infrastructure when they can't pay the loans back. And what's amazing about that is that they're using the World Trade System's own playbook to compete with their market economy system. It's kind of evil genius. And the Chinese have their Belt and Road Initiative, which is giving them control of infrastructure all over Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and the ability to easily move the resources they control around. On top of that, they're gobbling up the resources that the world is restructuring their economies around at brilliant speed, while our country continues to act as if the countries of the world will always operate as pawns on a fossil fuel-dominated chessboard. And so when you look at that and the way they're talking about China since, it's becoming clear that the chessboard is changing. Minerals are becoming the new oil. And we've been dominating the wrong game.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. If you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the 218th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, hello, welcome to my attempt to use Congress as my window to the world. I started this podcast in order to learn what is being done with my tax money and in my name by watching Congress and reading for myself the changes that they were making to our national laws. And I've been doing that out loud for damn near 8 years now. Just so you know, I'm not in any political party. I belong to no groups. I do all the researching and writing for this show. I'm not in any networks. I have no corporate sponsors writing copy for me to regurgitate to you to try to manipulate you into buying shit. I do this because I want to know what's going on and because the corporate media is failing miserably at informing us of anything happening that could possibly harm the profits of their advertisers. And so basically, I wanted a show like this to exist, and so I'm creating it. And when I say a show like this, I mean one about our lawmakers that gives me all their sources. You know, because where are you getting your information from? That's the question that I have all the time when I watch the corporate news stations. They don't tell us. And so I want a list of links to every article, every stat, every document, every whatever that they reference. And so I do that. And so check out the show notes for any episode of Congressional Dish. They're on my not pretty, but it's functional website, congressionaldish.com. But also they're sometimes right in your app, depending on what podcast app you use to listen. I know they show up beautifully in Overcast. But I give you links to everything I watch and read for every episode, and I've been doing that since the beginning. And even though it's an enormous pain in the ass, I give you timestamps for clips from long hearings so that you can easily listen to those clips in context. Because yeah, I edit because I'm summarizing 5 hearings in one episode, which is like 12 hours of audio. At least I am in this episode. So I think that you should be able to find the clip and listen to it unedited to see if you think I'm being fair. I think it's important to earn your trust, and the show notes are how I do that. You shouldn't have to trust me. In fact, I think it's healthy if you don't. And I'm proud that my relationship with my audience is based on trust. I can't fund this podcast by being paid by companies to manipulate you into buying their products. You have to be able to trust that what I tell you is because I believe it to be true, whether I'm talking about global economic systems or Chipotle burritos. It doesn't matter. No one tells me what to say ever. And so I fund my work a different way. This podcast is funded by a growing community of producers who acknowledge that this show, while it's free upfront to everyone on the planet, is still valuable, and they fund the podcast at whatever amount they think is fair. We call it value for value, and the freedom it gives us from corporate influence is worth every penny, I promise you. And then if you want to be heard as a producer, you can send in a brief note with your donation and tell me what you think. I love it when you tell me things that I don't know, or your opinion about previous episodes. But I do listen and learn when you nicely give me constructive production notes. You can say what you want to too, and I take as long as it takes to read your notes, or part of your notes if you send in a novel, on the bonus thank you episodes that you'll find in between main episodes. The main episodes are always numbered. And so if you find value in the episode you're going to hear today, please visit this episode's show notes in your app or on congressionaldish.com and support the show using whatever listed method works best for you. And if you hate that I put a sound effect over the words that would get an explicit label slapped on this show, then you can get an uncensored version of the show by pledging to pay per episode on Patreon. And I'm really close to having an uncensored feed set up for everyone who donates other ways, but Patreon is still the only uncensored feed we have for just a little while longer. But today's episode is one of the big picture types, and I know the topic might seem a little out of nowhere in this moment, because there's a lot going on right now, and I know a lot of you are wanting to know what's going on with the next COVID response bill, since the eviction moratorium is expiring and the unemployment provisions that provided $600 a week are expiring. You know, there should have been something signed by now, but there wasn't. You know, this Congress remains horrendous. And so real quick, since I know your lives and finances are being directly affected, where we stand as of this recording on July 30th is that the House Democrats passed a COVID response bill, the HEROES Act, back in mid-May. Now, yes, it does have a few shameless corporate favors in there, because of course it does, but it extends the eviction moratorium, it sends out another round of checks, and it extends the unemployment money, which is what most people seem to care about. The Republicans in the Senate, though, they haven't touched it. They just let it sit there for 2 months. Instead, after they got back from their recent 2-week vacation, the Senate Republicans took 1 whole week to write their bill. Or at least Mitch McConnell took a week to write the bill because they just skipped the whole committee process again. And so Mitch McConnell released his text of his bill, which they're calling the HEALS Act. And it's a goddamn nightmare of a bill. It cuts the unemployment payments. It doesn't extend the eviction moratorium. It essentially gives companies immunity from lawsuits if their workers or customers get COVID due to their negligence. But it's even worse than that, because it then gives the companies the ability to sue and get money from the people that sued them for suing them, with a much easier path to victory. And it also has the most fucked up priorities. For example, it spends $5 billion helping people who can't work and therefore can't pay their rent, but then gives almost $30 billion, almost 6 times as much, to the military to buy more F-35 jets, which, by the way, still don't work correctly. This program is basically welfare for Lockheed Martin at this point, a company that has nothing to do with COVID response, and it would be given 6 times the amount of money that would be given to people about to be thrown out of their homes. And that's just one example of the priorities in the Republican horror show known as the HEALS Act. But now that they've created an emergency situation by letting important provisions that so many Americans are counting on in order to keep a roof over their heads expire, well, now the Republicans are starting to negotiate with Democrats. But Mitch McConnell has made it crystal clear that getting legal immunity for businesses is their number one priority. And so now we have to see if the Democrats are going to cave on this while bragging that they got us crumbs, their usual MO, or if there's going to be no bill at all, or if Americans rise up in the streets or by calling Congress from the comfort of their couches, which we know actually works. Well, if Americans rise up and call and badger the Republicans and scare them into serving us instead of their corporate overlords, we could actually get a good bill. But the bottom line is, this is very far from done. But Congress has a month-long vacation scheduled for August 10th, and Lord knows nothing can be allowed to get in between this Congress and a vacation. And so that's when I'm expecting something to be signed. But until that happens and I can read the new law and tell you about it, follow me on Twitter @Briney, because I'm retweeting whatever I'm reading that I feel is worth your time. But while that whole COVID response debacle unfolds, I do want to shift focus away from COVID today because, well, the Trump administration, which has been scaring a lot of us in a lot of different ways lately, is scaring me in a way that isn't being discussed nearly enough, and that's their increasingly confrontational words and actions against China, a country with over 4 times as many people as we have here in the United States, an arsenal of nuclear weapons, and economic partners all over the world who aren't interested in joining a Trump-led coalition of the willing. So in order to get an idea of what's going on, I watched a bunch of recent hearings about China, and that led to some bigger picture realizations about what's going on a global scale. And so for those of you who love it when I dive into the world order, you're in for a treat today. Now, I have focused an episode on China somewhat recently. At the end of 2018, I did Congressional Dish 187. It's called Combating China. And so in this episode, I'm going to add to the information I collected for that one, in which that episode we looked at the unique economic model that the Chinese use and our relationship with China since the 1970s. And so if you're really interested in why China is being branded as an enemy lately, listen to that episode first. I will summarize it a little bit, but I'm going to move forward and assume that you've heard it and not spend too much time re-summarizing topics that were covered already there. But before I really get into it, I do just want to put this little disclaimer on what I'm about to say in this episode because I just don't want to deal with a bunch of accusations that I'm defending China. I know that the Chinese do bad shit. Like, for instance, there's a ethnic minority, a bunch of Muslims, they're called Uyghurs, that live in China, and I saw the videos, or pictures at least, of what appear to be Uyghurs, maybe being forced to sit on the ground with blindfolds and then being loaded onto trains. And we know that China has re-education camps and just creepy Nazi-like things like that. And so I definitely know that China does bad things and that no government should treat humans that way. I get it, okay? But I'm a U.S. taxpayer. I have exactly no role in the Chinese government. As an American, though, I have a role in the United States government as someone who funds it and votes in it. And so because the U.S. government represents me and uses my tax money, I am far harsher on the sins committed in my name than the sins committed by other countries. So please spare me the "but China" emails. I know, China bad sometimes. But so are we, and we have the ability to change the behavior of our country, not theirs. We can only control how we react to them. And so, disclaimer done. All right, and so to get this party started, let's do a little refresher on what I think the United States' official role in the world is at this moment. Because there is a well-documented history on this show and in the world that shows that the goal of our foreign policy since the end of World War II has been to get every country on Earth to participate in one global economic system, the one operated by the World Trade Organization, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund. After World War II, the idea behind creating this system was that if every country on Earth was economically connected and operated under the same set of laws, they wouldn't go to war against each other. And it's actually proving to be true, ironically, in regards to China, because there are many countries on Earth that have no interest in confronting China because they are so economically dependent on each other. But the supposed to be global government we've participated in creating and enforcing is not a democracy. We peasants play no role in choosing who represents us there. It's all done by appointment by elites. But many of the actions taken to enact and enforce this system are labeled as defending and expanding democracy. Democracy in this system is a code word. It's a propaganda word. Because we don't get votes and we have partners in this system, like Saudi Arabia run by murder kings, who are clearly not democracies, but are allies because they play the same economic game. It's all about the money, specifically corporate money, stock market money. The system enacted and enforced through the World Trade Organization is designed to ensure rights to corporations and rich investors, to enact and enforce a global economic system that allows them to operate freely around the earth, and they label that a market economy. Now, Investopedia defines a market economy as one where governments are supposed to play as little a role as possible, and supply and demand will make the economic decisions. So the idea is like a good business will naturally be rewarded with customers, and a bad business will lose customers who choose to go elsewhere. But the system they created is not that in practice. The system that they label the market economy functions to limit the ability of local communities to stop corporations from raiding natural resources. It functions to limit local governments' abilities to protect their own industries. And it functions to shut down local laws that limit how much money corporations can take out of their countries. The countries that don't go along voluntarily and signed international trade agreements that put these global economic laws into place, Countries that keep laws that prevent multinational corporations from taking and profiting from their valuable natural resources, or countries that use too much tax money paying for things for their citizens that could be done by corporations for a profit. Well, those countries and their economic systems are threats to the so-called global market economy. And the governments that disobey or refuse to enact the market economy laws become enemies. There's a playbook that goes back to the end of World War II, when the institutions of the global market economy were created, that has been used over and over and over again to get other countries into the system. That once you know about it, it's impossible not to see functioning in real time, as we've documented on this show recently with the Trump administration's actions towards Venezuela and Iran. First, they generally try bribery to get the governments to change their laws in return for cash that the country needs. So the International Monetary Fund will go to the country and offer a fat loan to a government in the hopes that the people in charge will be short-sighted enough to not care that the loan terms make it damn near impossible to pay back. When the short-sighted government takes the money, the IMF acts basically like a loan shark. Only instead of threatening to break your legs for the cash, the IMF demands that economic laws be changed in return for leniency. But sometimes that doesn't work, which is when it's coup time. Sometimes the coup is done openly with military force, like we saw in Iraq in 2003. Sometimes it's done ineptly and weirdly by getting some dude to pretend he's the new president of the target country and hope everyone else on earth goes along with it, like the Trump administration is still trying to pull off in oil-rich Venezuela. And sometimes it's done in such a sneaky style that Americans don't even know we were involved, like the Ukraine regime change during the Obama years. But the goal is always the same: privatization. Let the corporations in and give them free as possible reign to pillage and profit. And why do we do this? Who wins in this system? The elites, who have captured the U.S. federal government by making a system based on bribery by another name, campaign contributions, the system that we use to elect our lawmakers and law enforcers. In a system like that, those people with the money get the lawmakers that they want, who then write laws in their favor. You know, the people who benefit are the few families who make their fortunes in the stock market, the people that make the big bucks, the people who get paid in dividends. And no, that doesn't include you because you have a 401k. Tricking Americans into funding retirements in the stock market casino was just a brilliant way of getting us to think we have real skin in this game. But the fact is that the vast majority of not just Americans, but global citizens get the majority of their money via paychecks. In fact, 45% of Americans, almost half of us, own no stock at all. A percentage that has increased since the turn of the century. And even if you do own stock, even if you do have a 401k, you're probably not in the baller crowd that's really benefiting from the market economy that treats the stock market as the economy, because 84% of all stocks owned by Americans are owned by the richest 10% of American families. The fact that hurts our egos, but is true, is that in the market economy system, the vast majority of us are nothing more than consumers and labor. We're the suckers who can and should be paying as much as possible for everything, and we're the help. This system truly benefits a tiny percentage of humans, and you can find their names on the global list of billionaires. Like it or not, that's what our country currently stands for on a global scale, and our military is the muscle for this system. That's why we have bases all over the planet. That's what we really fight for. And I know that this all might sound really extreme if this is your first episode of Congressional Dish. But I've done a lot of research over 17 years, 8 of those on the air, to lead me to that conclusion. And so I've listed a bunch of episodes relevant to this in this episode's show notes. So if this summary feels uncomfortable for you, I recommend you get caught up and meet me back here when you're ready. The World Trade Organization episode is a good place to start, and then poke around the various regime change episodes. There are quite a few. You'll get the details that this summary was lacking. But all of that brings me to China, which basically isn't playing nicely in the world trade system market economy game. And in the last month or so, the Trump administration has really changed their approach towards China in a disturbingly confrontational way. Why? Well, Attorney General Bill Barr spoke at the Gerald Ford Presidential Museum a couple weeks ago on July 16th, and in that speech, he listed China's sins.
Made in China 2025 is the latest iteration of the PRC's state-led mercantilist economic model. For American companies in the global marketplace, free and fair competition with China has long been a fantasy. To tilt the playing field to its advantage, China's communist government has perfected a wide array of predatory and often unlawful tactics: currency manipulation, tariffs, quotas, state-led strategic investment and acquisition, theft and forced transfer of intellectual property, state subsidies, dumping, cyber attacks, and industrial espionage.
Okay, so let's break that down.
Made in China 2025 is the latest iteration of the PRC's state-led mercantilist economic model.
So that's what they're labeling the enemy economic model. It's one that's state-led, so government-controlled, and mercantilist, a label that accuses them of wanting to use government as a tool to increase their government's power. The market economy, though, the one that we serve, is based on increasing the power of multinational companies. We want government written by and enforced for corporations, at least officially. Because the market economy is what the power of the U.S. federal government is harnessed to serve at this moment, which is a situation that's been advancing my entire lifetime. And advancing the market economy to the point that it rules every country on earth is the goal of the overwhelming majority of people currently controlling the lawmaking, Congress, and law enforcing, Trump administration, parts of the U.S. federal government. Free the market fundamentalists have fully captured the Republican Party, and they have control of the Democratic Party right now, but there are some rebels who have weaseled their way into the Democratic Party. But our national government at this moment is operating on the theory that China bad because they think government good, and they want theirs to have power over both the peasants and the companies.
To tilt the playing field to its advantage, China's communist government has perfected a wide array of predatory and often unlawful tactics.
Unlawful in World Trade Organization laws, which we know from studying the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2016. Those episodes are listed for you in the show notes for this episode. But we know now that WTO laws are created in meetings with elites and corporate representatives that are so secret that members of Congress can't even access them. And so the public is not involved in making WTO laws. But here's the list of WTO laws that China is accused of breaking.
Currency manipulation.
So purposely changing the value of their money. Manipulating the dollar is what the Federal Reserve exists to do, but okay.
Tariffs.
Which is requiring taxes on foreign stuff sold in their country, which, by the way, Trump has put all kinds of tariffs on Chinese stuff lately. But okay.
Quotas.
Which are limits on how much corporate crap is allowed to be sold in China. Which, by the way, we have totally done this to China too. The W administration put quotas on clothes from China, for example, but again, okay.
State-led strategic investment and acquisition.
Which is government having a strategy for buying and paying for things.
Theft and forced transfer of intellectual property.
Stealing corporate ideas or requiring corporate ideas to be shared as a requirement for being allowed to profit in their country. Ooh. But seriously, the corporate guys really hate this one.
State subsidies.
Which is government helping to pay for things that the government wants to encourage. Like how the government helps us to pay for health insurance if we don't have a boss who pays for it. That's an example of a subsidy.
Dumping.
Get your head out of the gutter. Not everything is a poop joke. Dumping in this context means selling stuff overseas for really cheap.
Cyber attacks.
Dun, dun, dun. Oh, those actually could really suck.
And industrial espionage.
Which is spying on corporations. Which our taxes do pay 17 intelligence agencies to spy on individuals and governments, but spying on corporations? That is going too far. But that's the Chinese sin list. And some of those are not crimes. Some of those are maybe crimes that the free marketeers do all the time. And cyber attacks seem like crimes. But a lot of those, government subsidies, limiting foreign stuff coming into the country, those are examples of government being functional. But if a government is functional in this world, the corporation can't be truly free. And freedom for multinational corporations, that's the real American dream. And so if you think about it, if China chooses to run their economy differently, with a lot more government involvement in the decisions of companies, how can we enforce a global economic system based on limited government involvement while a huge country like China operates their economy successfully in a different, more government-heavy way? So the problem here is bigger than China, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo knows it. Here he is speaking about China on July 23rd, just last week.
The challenge of China demands exertion, energy from democracies, those in Europe, those in Africa, those in South America, and especially those in the Indo-Pacific region. And if we don't act now, ultimately, the CCP will erode our freedoms and subvert the rules-based order that our societies have worked so hard to build.
The global order is threatened, and that cannot be allowed. Same administration after administration. Because China operating an economic system that's more government-based is nothing new. Here's Orville Schell. He is the former dean of the UC Berkeley School of Journalism, and he's now the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. And I don't know what that is, but I do know that Schell is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is an organization that started as a front organization for bankers that they used to argue for their interest. And it's currently the organization of global elites pushing the market economy system upon the world. And so he's one of them. And here's the lesson he gave to Congress on July 1st about our government's attempts to absorb China into the market economy system in the recent decades.
We were accustomed for many, many decades, and I've written a long piece that's in the record, I think is my testimony, that engagement was the kind of center of how we related to China. And what were the presumptions of that? Well, the presumption was that, and this began in 1972 with Kissinger and Nixon going to China, that if we simply engaged China across the board, that slowly we would have a greater likelihood of more convergence rather than divergence, that we would slowly morph out of the Cold War. And what is so extraordinary about the policy of engagement, and I'm not one of the people who believes it was an erroneous policy. I do, however, believe it is a failed policy. But it was not erroneous precisely because for 8 presidential administrations, the United States government sought, and I think this is the height of leadership, to slowly bend the metal of China, to help China, to assist China to morph out of its Maoist revolutionary period into something that was more soluble and convergent with the world as it existed outside, both the marketplace, international order, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if you look at all of these different administrations and go through them one by one, as I've done in the piece that's in your record, it is so striking to see how one president, Republican and Democrat, came in after another, usually with a rather jaundiced view of China. Ultimately, they embraced the notion that we should try to engage China. So what happened? Well, I think just to cut to the chase here, what happened was that we have a regime in China now that's very different in its set of presumptions than that pathway that was laid out by Deng Xiaoping in 1978-79 of reform and opening. Without reform, without the presumption that China will both reform economically and politically to some degree, engagement has no basis, because if you're not converging, then you're diverging. And if China actually is not trying to slowly evolve out of its old Leninist, Maoist mold sort of form of government, then it is, in a sense, deciding that that is what it is, and that is what its model is, and that is what it's going to be projecting around the world.
In the same hearing, Meredith Sumter summarized what China is trying to do today. Meredith Sumter is the current head of research strategy and operations at the Eurasia Group, which is a group that helps rich people and companies make money in foreign countries using the WTO economic laws. She also, according to her LinkedIn, worked in the State Department and the CIA during the W. Bush and Obama years, working in China at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And here's what she said China's goal is now.
There are limits to how much we can force China to not be China. And China is working to try to create space for its own unique model within what has been, up until just now with this competition, a largely Western-based market consensus of how economic systems should work.
And she continued,
Beijing decision makers believe that their state-directed economic system is the foundation of the livelihood of their political system. In other words, we have been spending our energies trying to force China to change, and China is not willing to change an economic model that it believes underpins its political longevity.
So China wants their government heavily involved in their economic system, and the experts are saying to this day very clearly that that isn't changing, which is a threat to the market economy being global because China's economy is proving that financial success can be achieved using a system that isn't based on World Trade Organization laws and freedom for private corporations. They're proving there's another way. And the multinationals' profits are being threatened by this competition. So here's Attorney General Bill Barr, and in this clip, he's going to say PRC, which stands for the People's Republic of China, which is China's formal name.
A centerpiece of this effort is the Chinese Communist Party's Made in China 2025 initiative, a plan for PRC domination of high-tech industries like robotics, advanced information technology, aviation, electric vehicles, and many other technologies. Backed by hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies, this initiative poses a real threat to U.S. technological leadership.
So the Chinese government is funding businesses in those sectors, and it's threatening the multinationals, which, as I've said many times before, are not American, even though we pay to open markets for them and defend their shipping routes with our military, which even Attorney General Barr acknowledged in his speech to be true.
In a globalized world, American corporations and universities alike may view themselves as global citizens rather than as American institutions. But they should remember that what allowed them to succeed in the first place was the American free enterprise system, the rule of law, and the security afforded by America's economic, technological, and military strength. Globalization does not always point in the direction of greater freedom. A world marching to the beat of the communist Chinese drum will not be a hospitable one for institutions that depend on free markets, free trade, or the free exchange of ideas. There was a time when American companies understood that they saw them and understood this, and they saw themselves as American and proudly defended American values.
But not anymore. The multinationals that were built using our infrastructure and our judicial system, using our tax money that paid to develop many of their products, and our military that overthrew countries so that they could have the resources that they need to profit. Well, now these companies base their headquarters in tax havens to avoid contributing to this country, and they make deals with any country or company that they think will help them make a buck, regardless of U.S. policy. The multinationals have become stateless powers that operate in their own interests. And even the people devoted to the market economy that allowed this to happen are acknowledging that our government's power has been severely weakened by the freedom we've fought to give these companies, because they don't have to follow or promote U.S. policy. And they don't. And with our government weakened due to decades of bipartisan policies that have disconnected our government from the businesses that used to be American, and with China using its government to create businesses that fund the Chinese government, WTO laws be damned.
The People's Republic of China is now engaged in an economic blitzkrieg, an aggressive, orchestrated, whole of government, indeed whole of society campaign to seize the commanding heights of the global economy and to surpass the United States as the world's preeminent technological superpower.
And they're well on their way. Because even though American world order guys say stuff like this, here's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo this week.
It's true. There are differences. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is deeply integrated into the global economy. But Beijing is more dependent on us than we are on them.
They say stuff like that, but details paint a very different picture. I mean, hello, COVID. Remember masks? Remember why we were told not to wear them in the beginning of all this? It's because there was a mask shortage. And why was there a mask shortage? It was because damn near all of the masks are made in China. And China had an issue with the virus too, and so they kept the masks for themselves. And we couldn't do anything about it because we have very few mask manufacturers here. And so until Target in Old Navy and your grandma stepped in to sew ourselves some masks, we didn't have enough. We were dependent on China for something so essential to our public health system. They weren't dependent on us. And as far as the big picture global economic scene is concerned, here's Attorney General Barr explaining why he's so worried that China's economic blitzkrieg could with multinational tech company profits.
The PRC's drive for technological supremacy is complemented by its plan to monopolize rare earth materials, which play a vital role in industries such as consumer electronics, electric vehicles, medical devices, and military hardware. According to the Congressional Research Service, from the 1960s to the 1980s, the United States led the world in rare earth production. Since then, production has shifted almost entirely to China, in large part due to the lower labor costs and lighter economic and environmental regulation. The United States is now dangerously dependent on the PRC for these essential materials. Overall, China is America's top supplier, accounting for about 80% of our imports. The risk of dependence are real. In 2010, for example, Beijing cut exports of rare earth materials to Japan after an incident involving the disputed islands in the East China Sea. The PRC could do the same to us.
So China has a clear dominance over rare earth minerals. And here's why that matters. Here's Dr. David Solon. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Renewable Power at the U.S. Department of Energy, and here he is testifying to the Senate in May of 2019.
Critical minerals are used in many products important to the U.S. economy and national security, and they are particularly important to the most innovative clean energy technologies. For example, some of the minerals DOE considers the most critical in terms of supply risk include gallium for LEDs, the rare earths dysprosium and neodymium for permanent magnets and wind turbines and electric vehicles, and cobalt and lithium for electric vehicle and grid batteries. The U.S. is dependent on foreign sources of many critical minerals, and we also currently lack the domestic capability for downstream processing of materials, as well as the manufacture of some products made from them.
So what that means is that a transition to clean energy is dependent on rare earth minerals. And full disclosure, even though this is well known, but my husband is a utility-scale solar power engineer. And so obviously my family believes in clean energy technology, we want it to succeed, and completely support a global transition away from burning fossil fuels for energy. But this is an inconvenient fact that needs to be acknowledged by everyone that feels the same way. Natural resources are needed to make that technology work, and a lot of them. But it's not just clean energy that depends on minerals. Our military does too. Here's Joe Bryan. He works at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and the Atlantic Council is another one of those market economy devoted DC think tanks. But here he is testifying to the Senate about a month ago.
From communications gear that keeps our troops connected on the battlefield, to unmanned aerial and subsurface platforms, to tactical ground vehicles transitioning away from lead acid, lithium-ion batteries are everywhere. That is not surprising. Energy storage can not only increase capability, but by reducing fuel use, can also help take convoys off the road and our troops out of harm's way.
So the Defense Department wants them. And then there's the minerals that us peasants need. So here's Nadal Nasser. He works at the National Minerals Information Center at the Department of the Interior. Here he is testifying in that same hearing about a month ago.
Mineral commodities are the foundation of modern society. Smartphones would have more dropped calls and shorter battery lives without tantalum capacitors and cobalt-based cathodes in their lithium-ion batteries. Bridges, buildings, and pipelines would not be as strong without vanadium and other alloying elements in their steels. Medical MRI machines would use more energy and produce lower quality images without helium-cooled, niobium-based superconducting magnets.
So you can see there's all kinds of products that we use every day to power all kinds of technologies for all kinds of industries. You know, you're probably listening to me using one of the products that needs minerals right now. And the more we depend on products that need batteries, so like cell phones, energy storage batteries, and especially electric car batteries, the more minerals we're going to need. Here's Simon Moores. He's the founder of Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, which is a company in London that analyzes information about the lithium-ion battery supply chain. Here he is testifying in that same hearing in June.
The rise of these battery megafactories will require demand for raw materials to increase significantly. By 2029, so 10 years from now, demand for nickel will double, cobalt will grow 3 times, flake graphite and manganese by 4 times, lithium by more than 6 times.
So demand for minerals is going to soar along with the demand for battery-powered products, especially electric cars. And the rest of the world is preparing for this right now. Here's Joe Bryan, the Atlantic Council guy again.
The scale of global investment in the lithium-ion supply chain is massive, and investment patterns will have geopolitical impacts. Right now, commercial relationships are being forged and trade alliances hammered out. Decisions made over the next few years will define the global transportation industry for decades to come and plant the seeds of future political alliances. Maintaining our global influence and diplomatic leverage depends on us not just getting in the race, but setting the pace. From establishing priorities for research and development, to setting conditions for attracting investment, to, most importantly, hitting the accelerator on transportation electrification, there are things we can do. But to date, our actions have matched neither the scale of the opportunity, the efforts of our competitors, nor the risk we accept should we remain on the sidelines. And he continued. As a point of reference, note the scale of the Europeans' investment. Just one of the tranches of funding that has come out of the EU. Last December, they put $3.5 billion into supply chain investments. $3.5 billion, that's one tranche. I think the European Investment Bank has said that something like $100 billion has been channeled to the battery supply chain. So the scale of their effort is we sort of pale in comparison to that, notwithstanding your efforts, Madam Chairman. The other thing I would say is post-COVID, it's interesting. I think Europeans have seen support for electrification and the supply chain in their stimulus packages. I know Germany and France have both targeted those industries as part of their stimulus. And I think the reason for that is we obviously, countries are going to want to recover what they've lost, but they also are seeing this as an inflection point for them to decide where they want to be in the future. And so I think they've taken advantage of that opportunity and have sort of doubled down on it. And I think we're in the same position as we assess where we are and where we're going. But the scale of their commitment has been, I'll say, impressive.
And here's why that concerns me as an American who loves driving a car with a battery and hates walking on streets polluted by fossil fuels spewing tailpipes. Here's Daniel Simmons. He's the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the Department of Energy.
Material intensity and potential global demand is illustrated by a recent report, by a recent analysis by the head of Earth Sciences at the Natural History Museum in the UK. Using the most current technologies, for the UK to meet their 2050 electric car targets, it would require just under 2 times the current annual world cobalt production, nearly the entire world production of neodymium, 3/4 of the world's lithium production, and at least half of the world's copper production. And to put that in perspective, the population of the UK is only 66 million currently, while the population of the United States is 327 million.
So the whole world is competing for a very limited supply. And even if we had the supply, even if we conquered every country with mines rich in all of those minerals, we'd still not be in a position to be self-sufficient because, here's Joe Bryan.
Our weakness is throughout the supply chain. So if we have a stockpile of minerals, but they're not processed and usable, then I'm not sure how much good it does us. If we have to ship the stockpiled minerals to China for processing, that's probably not the most ideal scenario. So I think we have to look again holistically at the supply chain, look at what we need, and figure out how we position ourselves to attract the kind of massive economy-changing, transforming levels of investment that are happening globally to the United States.
And here's how far along we are in doing so. Here's Simon Moores. He's the expert on lithium ion in the world economy.
In the United States, progress is far too slow on building out a domestic lithium-ion economy, but the opportunities that remain are vast and pioneers have emerged. Tesla has continued to lead the industry and build on its Nevada Gigafactory by announcing supersized battery plants in Germany and China, and is expected to announce a fourth in Texas, which would give the United States its first ever 100% owned and made lithium-ion battery cells. Ohio has recognized the scale of this opportunity and attracted $2.3 billion from General Motors and LG Chem joint venture. You can also turn to Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee for electric vehicle and battery cell investment success. Yet these developments are more of a standalone achievement than a coherent US plan.
But meanwhile, in China, here's Dr. John Warner. He is the chairman of the National Alliance for Advanced Transportation Batteries and the chief customer officer at a company called American Battery Solutions, a company that helps other companies create battery manufacturing programs. Here he is testifying last year in the Senate.
Chinese companies are buying up energy materials supply sources around the globe in order to ensure that battery manufacturers based in China have access to reasonably stable supplies of low-cost materials.
And here's Simon Moores.
China is building the equivalent of one battery megafactory a week. The United States, one every 4 months.
And here's the result.
Since 2017, China's battery megafactory pipeline has increased from 9 to 107, of which 53 are now active and in production. Meanwhile, the United States has gone from 3 to 9 battery plants, of which still only 3 are active, the same number as just under 3 years ago.
And to break that down even further,
and all rely on imported raw materials and chemicals for the two main components that make a lithium-ion battery, the cathodes and the anodes. America has some of the best cathode know-how in the business, yet only 3 cathode plants producing under 1% of global output, while China produces over 2/3 of global supply from over 100 cathode facilities.
And
for graphite anode, the United States has 0 manufacturing plants, while China has 48 plants and controls 84% of total global anode supply.
And so basically, even if we don't exactly know what a cathode or an anode is, you can tell by those differences that we're getting our ass kicked by China in this competition for opportunities in this global race to play a leading role in the mineral and battery industries. And so not only is China not absorbing nicely into the global market economy system, but as we learned in episode 187, it's also issuing fat loans to countries and taking control of those countries' infrastructure when they can't pay the loans back. Like, they have some important ports and stuff. And what's amazing about that is that they're using the World Trade System's own playbook to compete with their market economy system. It's kind of evil genius. And the Chinese have their Belt and Road Initiative, which is giving them control of infrastructure all over Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and the ability to easily move the resources they control around. On top of that, they're gobbling up the resources that the world is restructuring their economies around at brilliant speed, while our country continues to act as if the countries of the world will always operate as pawns on a fossil fuel-dominated chessboard. And so when you look at that and the way they're talking about China since, it's becoming clear that the chessboard is changing. Minerals are becoming the new oil. And we've been dominating the wrong game. Now, the good news is that there are solutions to how late we are to the mineral game, and there are opportunities should we elect competent people willing to chase them. And so first, what can we do about not having the minerals themselves? Here's Joe Bryan of the Atlantic Council.
At the same time, from a national security perspective, we may not have minerals, but we in some segments of the supply chain, but we do have allies and people we can work with. And we need to really reach out to those folks. Like Australia is a perfect example. How are we working with Australia to diversify our supply chain to support our own needs and also perhaps to hedge against China?
Which will be important not only for being able to produce tech products in the United States, but also for simply keeping the industries that we currently have. Here's Thomas Duesterberg, another free marketeer from the Hudson Institute, which is another think tank.
Other witnesses have also mentioned rare earths and other important minerals for which we are dependent on China, such as tantalum, to a certain extent cadmium. These are all important to the $500 billion semiconductor industry, where the United States holds a technological lead and produces over 45% of the chips that it produces here in the United States.
So securing a mineral supply is going to be important, whether it's through contracts or more mining in the U.S., because we do know that we have some mineral resources right here at home. Here's Jonathan Evans. He's the president and COO of the multinational lithium company called Lithium Americas.
Lithium Nevada's corporation is a wholly owned subsidiary of Lithium Americas. It is headquartered in Reno, Nevada, and is developing a project called Thacker Pass, which is the largest known lithium resource in the United States. Thacker Pass will profoundly improve the supply of lithium chemicals by producing 25% of today's global lithium demand when in full production. Currently, the U.S. produces just 1% of lithium minerals and 7% of lithium chemicals.
So 25% of today's global demand it's good. But as we heard, that demand is projected to be 6 times as much not too long from now. But it is a start. But there are a lot of minerals on the critical minerals list, and we're going to need smart people in charge to handle the nuances of figuring out how to get and use each one. Here's Nidal Nasser of the Department of the Interior answering questions posed by Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. This was last month.
What portion of the supply chain, either upstream or downstream, needs the most attention in terms of our national security?
Thank you, Ranking Member Manchin. So it really, the answer depends on the commodity. So different commodities will have different bottlenecks in their supply chains. In some cases, there's a highly concentrated production on the mining stage. In other cases, it might be further downstream. So for example, for niobium, an element that's produced in only a handful of mines worldwide. And so there are very few mines that are producing it, and a single mine might be producing somewhere on the order of 2/3 of the world's supply. On the other hand, there might be commodities where it's really not about mining, and there's enough concentrate being produced, but we're simply not recovering it further downstream, such as many of the byproducts. So earlier, one of the other witnesses mentioned tellurium. There's a lot of tellurium in some of the concentrate that we're mining with copper. Once it gets to our copper electrolytic refineries, it's simply not recovered for economic reasons. And so there are different stages for different commodities. And that's why I mentioned in my testimony that we do need to look at these supply chains individually to figure out what really is the bottleneck and what strategy would be most effective at reducing that bottleneck.
So one of the minerals that we know is needed and will have value is not being collected by the copper mining companies. They're basically just throwing it away, which is so strategically stupid. But to make that stop, government intervention in their business is needed. Because they either need to be required by the government to, say in return for being given the privilege of mining our land, you have to collect the strategically valuable minerals that they're throwing away for profit reasons. Or we can use tax money, subsidies, to pay those companies to do this. But both of those actions are spoken about when China does it, as if they're crimes. Because government making rules or offering money to affect a business's decisions does not fit into the free market ideology. But if we care about our country on the global chessboard, that's something we have to do, because the market is deciding that valuable minerals aren't valuable enough for them in the short term to bother saving them. Because markets don't care about long-term security of countries, and so countries need to set conditions on companies, which means we need to elect people who are not opposed to doing it. Now, there's also an opportunity here for the young people in this country. And I know this audience has a lot of high school and college students. And so these next few clips are for you. Here's John Warner. This is the guy that works for the company that helps other companies get into the battery business.
There's very few universities today that actually do focus on a program to develop battery engineers, which is one of the most unique engineering fields because it does compromise and compose of all of the engineering facets, from thermodynamics to electronics and software to the chemistry of it.
Now, the reason this guy was testifying to Congress to begin with, or one of the reasons, is because he needs just 300 battery engineers, and he doesn't know if he can find that many in the United States. So that means supply and demand, right? There's a shortage of battery engineers, which means there's a demand, which means those jobs will pay well. And one of the things you might want to know is my husband, like I said, he's a utility scale solar engineer, but he graduated from college in 2004. And then he got his master's in mechanical engineering in 2006. And so there was no solar power engineering degree to be had. So he went and looked for all of the different pieces that he would need to learn in order to make himself a solar engineer. And so even though there's not a lot of programs for battery engineering, you can do the same thing. You can do, electrical engineering or mechanical engineering, and then just pick up the pieces, the individual classes that you would need to make yourself a battery engineer. And the people that do that first, they're the ones that are going to get all the money when there is a short supply and high demand for people in a certain field. There's also a member of our government expressing a need for another kind of worker that's in short supply and high demand. Here's Joe Balish. He's the Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the U.S. Department of the Interior.
At the Department of the Interior, we're seeing a graying of our own staff in terms of the expertise for mining in general, and that is something that we see nationwide.
Now, mining isn't an industry that most people think of as being a wise choice for the future. It seems like a job of the past. But someone has to go and get those minerals, and not many people younger than the boomers know how to do it. And so there's opportunity here, too, for young people that are aware of the global thirst for minerals and how key they are to every clean energy plan being put out by every nation on Earth. There's also opportunities in the mineral game after the minerals are found and dug up for individuals and for our country. Here's Joe Bryan of the Atlantic Council.
Now, we can't change geology and create resources where they don't exist, but we can change direction and compete for supply chains jobs in minerals extraction, processing, anode and cathode production, and cell production.
Processing and production. Because you can't just dig up a mineral and stick it in a cell phone. Things that I don't understand need to be done to them to make them usable. And so here's some of the opportunities available in that regard. Here's Simon Moores, the expert on the lithium-ion battery industry.
Developing this midstream of the supply chain will create a domestic ecosystem engine for more battery plants to be built, more electric vehicles to be made, more energy storage systems to be installed, and will spark the development of domestic mining and chemical processing. However, be under no illusions that the United States needs to build this 21st century industry from scratch. FDR's New Deal, for example, built core infrastructure that the United States still relies on today. Nearly 100 years later, in similar economic and industrial circumstances, your country has to do this all over again. Yet, instead of dams, you need to build battery megafactories in their tens. Instead of highways and bridges and tunnels, you need to build the supply chains to enable these megafactories to operate securely and consistently. These include cathode and anode plants and the lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and manganese sources to feed them. And this has to be done at a speed, scale, and quality that will make most US corporations feel uncomfortable. Even more, these supply chains need to be underpinned by giga-sized battery recycling facilities to match the scale of these new operations and close the loop. One can also look to the creation of a widespread US semiconductor industry back in the 1980s. The lead that the United States built in semiconductors and computing power has sustained your country's dominance in this space for over 5 decades. Those who invest in battery capacity and supply chains today will hold the sway of industrial power for generations to come.
Which sounds good to me. I'd love for us to make things again. I'd also like for us to be as self-sufficient as possible again. The whole ongoing PPE fiasco should be proving to us right now that we need reliable supply chains for a lot of essentials here at home. We shouldn't buy everything from multinationals. There's a lot of ways that we can get cut off from the things that we need when we do that. Because of the host country's governments, saying, oh no, you can't ship those masks out, we want them here. Or because the companies themselves decide that there's more profit to be made by selling essentials to someone else. And there is a way, even if we don't have some of the minerals under our soil to dig up, that we can mine for critical materials. Joe Bryan just mentioned it. There's a huge opportunity in recycling. So here's Robert Kang. He's the CEO of Blue Whale Materials, which is a company that specializes in recycling tech garbage.
We need to collect far more of the spent batteries for recycling. The U.S. currently collects less than 5%, while Europe collects approximately 40% or more. Secondly, we need to expand the United States' capacity to process batteries. Today, we ship most of our collected lithium-ion batteries for recycling to China, South Korea, and Europe. Increasing U.S. processing capacity will allow U.S. businesses to control the flow of these metals earlier in the supply chain. Lastly, we should encourage refining capabilities here in the U.S. A market for recycled metals will support investments to strengthen the entire lithium-ion battery industry in the U.S.
And if we do that, here's Robert King speaking to Senator Angus King of Maine.
You know, I've heard estimates that anywhere from about 20 to 30% of the world's mineral needs can be met by recycling.
Well, that's not insignificant. I mean,
that's not insignificant.
That's
absolutely.
a big number.
And actually, it's reclaiming value from our waste stream.
Right.
You know, one way to think about this is if you could change your perspective. I believe, you know, one of the next new mines of the future are our urban cities, our homes. We have these this material locked away in our drawers and in boxes that we don't look at too often. So if we can promote collection, if we can take these, you know, spent batteries away from or bring them back to this industry, I think we can claim a significant amount of minerals.
But this is what's happening. Here's Robert King still speaking to Senator Angus King, and then you'll hear Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who is the committee chairman.
We are well aware of foreign entities now that are coming into the U.S. and setting up recycling facilities here because they see these minerals. And it's widely known that the U.S. is one of the largest producers of spent lithium-ion batteries.
They're mining under our very noses.
Yes, sir.
And a domestic resource.
Yes, sir.
Ridiculous.
Who is it?
Well, I do know that there is a Korean company that is coming in. There's a Canadian company that's setting up facilities here, as well as we are aware of conversations and research by Chinese firms, recyclers who are coming into this market.
So we're giving multinationals the freedom to take our recycling industry too? This one seems like a no-brainer. Americans could and should be recycling the batteries we've already brought into our country to secure a supply of all these different minerals for our country. And so, obviously, Congress has been told this, and so what is Congress doing? Well, a lot of the usual suspects are focused, unsurprisingly, like lasers, upon the mining part of this equation. Senators like Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who's taken almost $150,000 from people associated with just one company, just First Energy Corp, a company that's been desperately trying to get the government to bail it out of its bad choice to cling to their coal investments. That's Joe Manchin's number 2 contributing company over the course of his coal-stained career, and he's also taken tens of thousands of dollars at least from other coal mining companies. And so, of course, this guy paid by mining interests is looking for opportunities for the mining-centered corporations that he serves. And so here's where he's looking to change some laws.
Yet here in the United States, we have the General Mining Law of 1872, which frankly is nothing short of an embarrassment to our country. In 1872, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, and Susan B. Anthony was served an arrest warrant and fined for voting. Tells you how antiquated our laws are for the hard rock mining. If we are serious about reducing our import reliance for critical minerals, our mining laws need to be updated. We need to improve the regulatory scheme for mines in low-risk yet high-grade areas, end the claim patent system, and help the mining industry put themselves in a better light in the public by establishing a royalty to share the profits with the American people.
So, and this does work, actually. When you give the American people money, they tend to turn a blind eye towards things that they would otherwise be against. So it's one of the reasons why Alaska, which people live in Alaska largely because it is friggin' gorgeous. The nature there and all of the things that you can do outdoors and the hunting, and people love the outdoors in Alaska. And yet they also allow Alaska to be pillaged for fossil fuels. And that's because people in Alaska get checks from the fossil fuel industry. And so it is one way to get us to go along with it. And he's also open to these so predictable deregulation ideas being offered to Congress by Thomas Duesterberg of the Hudson Institute. Because every problem can be solved by freeing corporations from more rules, if you're a disciple of the market economy religion, as this guy definitely is.
In the longer run, as Senator Manchin alluded to, we need to revise our mining laws to speed up the permitting process. and perhaps put some time limit on the environmental reviews and the mining permitting for critical materials.
So, that's pretty predictable. I'm sure it's surprising to no one that this would be used as an opportunity to gut environmental laws. But this is something we need to fight, which some in Congress, all Democrats, based on what I witnessed, are aware of. So here's Senator Martin Heinrich, a Democrat from New Mexico.
My constituents is the incredible legacy of uncleaned up mines across the West. There are thousands of them. A few years ago, during the Gold King mine spill, irrigators had to close off their ditches, not water their crops, not water their livestock. There were municipal and tribal impacts as huge amounts of released heavy metals came downstream because of the uncleaned up legacy of 150 years of abandoned mines all across the Mountain West. So I think if we're going to, create a path forward, one of the things we need to do is really think about reforming the 1872 Mining Act if we're going to create the environment where some of these other things can move forward in a first world country.
And my family has been directly affected by this uncleaned up mine situation because Joe's family, Joe is my husband, his dad's side of the family is from a lovely little mining town called Butte, Montana, which, yes, became famous by Beavis and Butthead because they visited Butte, Montana, but I love Butte, Montana. It's a great little town, great people, but it is also home to the Berkeley Pit, which is a giant pool of water in an abandoned mine, which is super, super toxic. The government or the companies that were mining, I'm not entirely sure at this point who was supposed to clean it up, but it was supposed to be cleaned up decades ago when the mine was shut down. It never was. And so now if you go to Butte, Montana, last time I went to the Berkeley Pit, it cost $1 to get in, which helps them to maintain it as best they can to protect the water resources around there. But I can tell you that I never, ever, ever drink the water in Butte. Never. Because it's not good water. Because the mines were never cleaned up. And there's a lot of cancer in places like that. And so we do have a big problem with the way the mining industry has already behaved. And so there are people like me that have seen stuff like that with my own eyes, that when you tell me you want to mine for anything, even if it's mining for minerals that are good for and essential, not just good, but essential for clean energy. When I hear that, my spidey sense immediately says, bad idea. And there's going to be a lot of people like that. And so the environmental laws can't be gutted in this process if we actually want to raise up an industry around minerals. And the great news about this is that environmental laws do not need to be gutted, according to the experts, because they are saying that that is not the reason that we're losing to China right now. So here's Paul Zimkiewicz, probably butchered that name, but he's the director of the West Virginia Water Research Institute. And in this clip, he's speaking to Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat, by the way, which just shows you that you can't judge a member of Congress based on his party, especially if they have a D by their names. By the way he speaks, you'd think he was a big business Republican, but nope. Democrat Joe Manchin is talking to this guy, Paul Zimkiewicz. I'm not going to even try and say it again. But whatever, listen to the clip.
Some price support, if not market support, is needed in the early stages because the first thing the Chinese will do, and they've done it before, is drop the price on the world market because it's a monopoly. And that'll drive anyone out of business. Mountain Pass, which is our only active mine right now in the United States, sends all of its oxide product to China for refining.
Is that because environmental laws in America were making it very difficult for us to do that process?
I think, and I'm not an economist, but I think it's just because they have the supply chain.
And even the private sector is telling this Congress that gutting environmental laws is not necessary. Here's Jonathan Evans. He is the president and COO of Lithium Americas, which is the company that owns the mine that they are creating in Nevada to mine for lithium.
There are ways to do this, and I think it can be done very, very safely. If you look at traditional sources, at least in lithium, but I also know in cobalt and others, I think projects can do good and do well. Even under the current environmental laws that we have or what's being promulgated in the future, it's possible to live in both worlds.
And in fact, having strong environmental laws is the only way to prevent endless lawsuits and protests by crazy nutbags like me who want to drink clean water. And where people like me who want clean water and the minerals needed for electric cars and solar panels and a fossil-free future and cell phones and for all of it, where we can be reasoned with and work with these companies is in the permitting process. So here's Jonathan Evans again, the president and COO of Lithium Americas. He's speaking in this clip to Senator Angus King of Maine.
You go next across the border to Canada or Australia, they still have strict environmental standards as well, but they accomplish what Senator Murkowski had said, it's 7 to 10 years to get approvals here in the United States. There's lots of mineral resources. In those countries, it's usually about 2 years because there's very strict process. Agencies work together and they have to get back and close the process out where things can drag.
Well, one of the things we did in Maine that was helpful, it might be useful, is one-stop shopping. In other words, you don't have to go serially to 5 agencies. You have one lead agency and everybody else works through that process. And that we found that to be very effective.
Which sounds perfectly reasonable. Why should a company be doing the same analysis over and over again for each different agency? We can structure environmental reviews in a way that allows more partnership with state and local agencies. It's possible to speed up reviews without compromising on safety. And so what is this Congress doing? Well, it turns out that even though this issue is so far off the radar right now, what with a, deadly virus raging and law enforcement beating, gassing, and killing us with impunity and Trump being Trump all the time. I mean, who's paying attention to this? But even though we are distracted for justifiable reasons, legislation is already written in this Congress and a clear, accomplishable path for getting into law this year has been discussed. And so here's the author of the American Minerals Security Act, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. Appreciate you pointing out the importance of mineral security for our military. Some of us think that our American Mineral Security Initiative would be a good fit within the NDAA that will be coming before us for floor action in these next few days. So thank you for that reminder.
It's Dingleberry time! And well, the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, it's the thing that authorizes our wars every single year, and it's always signed every single year. Well, the NDAA for this year isn't done yet, but a first draft has passed the Senate, and something similar to her bill is in there. But the NDAA and the government funding provide 2 dingleberry opportunities for this to hitchhike into law. And the good news is that the bill that she wrote is a decent one. Now, I've outlined the whole bill for you in the show notes, the whole bill that Lisa Murkowski's committee has been working on for at least the last 2 years. But even though it's super weak, I like it. The most impactful thing it would do is order the government to assess our resources, so like the minerals under our soil and the extent of our workforce. But it doesn't gut environmental laws. And even though it's a small first step, getting some official analyses of what we currently have is a step worth taking and long overdue. But for the most part, outside of Murkowski's committee and some of the foreign relations committees where witnesses are warning Congress that there's a whole global economic shift happening, China is making brilliant strategic moves, and we're barely involved, well, Congress, for the most part, is not doing much. And so the Trump administration is filling the void. And so here's how they're acting, not just speaking, but acting. In order to deal with the fact that China is using its government-centered economic model to put itself at the center of this forming global economy, more of which centers around minerals than we seem to be aware of. Here's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo this week.
The Department of Justice and other agencies have vigorously pursued punishment for these crimes. And so our Department of Defense has ramped up its efforts, freedom of navigation operations out throughout the East and South China Seas and in the Taiwan Strait as well. And we've created a space force to help deter China from aggression on that final frontier.
So the Defense Department, as we looked at in detail in episode 187, is focusing on the South China Sea, where China is claiming a lot of territory to be its own. And it's worth noting that some of the territory claims that they're making are so far from China's shore that it is ridiculous. But here's a summary of what that's all about. Here's Gregory Poling, the director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is another think tank. This is testimony from June 30th.
Chinese interests and Chinese claims have expanded considerably over the decades. Prior to the 1990s, the South China Sea featured a dispute over islands. And then Beijing decided to declare strait baselines in internal waters around the paracels, and more worryingly, historic rights throughout the entirety of the South China Sea, claiming in some form all waters, all airspace, all seabed, in contravention of international law. Over the last decade, Beijing has become far more aggressive in pursuing that illegal claim. At the end of 2013, China embarked on an unprecedented campaign of artificial island building and militarization, which today allows China to deploy a 24/7 presence of naval, Coast Guard, and paramilitary forces throughout every inch of the 9-dash line, slowly pushing its neighbors away from their legal rights out of the waters guaranteed to them by international law.
And they're also making moves outside of the South China Sea. This is Representative Gerald Connolly of Virginia.
And meanwhile, China is, the title of this hearing is Maritime Ambitions. It's not just in the South China Sea. The fact that the Chinese built and now are operating the Hambantota port facility, which could easily become a military base because of the indebtedness of the Sri Lankan government and its inability to finance and serve the debt on that finance, has given China a strategic location through which passes, I'm told, about 30% of all the world's shipping. And it's a real nice reminder to India that now China has that strategic location.
In fact, China has ports in strategic positions all over the world now, one as close as the islands off of the east coast of Florida. And all of that is on top of their Belt and Road Initiative, which has been under construction since 2013 and is a network of railroads and pipelines connecting China to Europe and increasingly Africa, and connecting all the countries in between. So China's investing in infrastructure that other countries want and gaining power in the process. And I'm sorry, but that's brilliant. But when you look at these moves through the mineral economy lens, China needs to be able to move their minerals around, to collect them for processing and then ship them back out to the world in order to make money. And so if they can control the shipping lanes, and if they can own strategic ports around the world, they can make sure that no one, the U.S. in particular as the muscle for the world trade system, can shut their plans down by preventing their businesses from moving their products. But we want the ability to control those shipping lanes on behalf of the multinationals that intend to use the resources of the world. Even though the United States claiming jurisdiction on waters on the other side of the planet is even more ridiculous on its face than China's claims. But when you view our military as the muscle for the world trade system, it makes a lot more sense. With our taxes and humans being deployed to the South China Sea because the multinationals have their own shipping plans, and we don't want China to have the power to shut those down. And then Pompeo also mentioned the Space Force. Now, when the Trump administration created the Space Force, I think a lot of us pictured Trump, under the desk in the Oval Office playing with his Star Wars toys and then demanding his own Space Force. I know Twitter had a lot of fun with it. But the Space Force isn't just a way for Trump to get a cool jacket. On April 6th, 2020, during the beginning of COVID, when that was really the only story on anybody's radar, Trump issued an executive order describing the Space Force policy, and it says, quote, "Successful long-term exploration and scientific discovery of the moon, Mars, and other celestial bodies will require partnership with commercial entities to recover and use resources, including water and certain minerals in outer space," unquote. And so we don't have a lot of minerals here in the U.S.? That's fine. We'll just go jack them from the moon. But the problem, like with so many of the Trump plans, is that laws exist. Treaties were signed in the 1960s, which make it a legal danger zone for Trump to send spacemen up to just take whatever the multinationals want from the moon or other planets. But the Trump administration says in his executive order that, quote, "outer space is a legally and physically unique domain of human activity, and the United States does not view it as global commons," unquote. And it's our official policy during the Trump reign to keep our country out of something called the Moon Agreement, which is a rabbit hole for another day. But whatever ground rules that countries in this world are working out, we're not agreeing to play by those rules. And Mike Pompeo is officially directed by the executive order to, quote, "take all appropriate actions," unquote, to, quote, "encourage international support," unquote. And let's just keep in mind that our State Department, for at least my parents' entire lifetime, considers regime changes to be appropriate ways to get countries to support our shit. But the support that Pompeo will encourage will be encouraged, quote, for the public and private recovery and use of resources in outer space, unquote. And so basically, our taxes are being used to give companies free rein in outer space too. With the Space Force, we're going to pay and they're going to profit. They being the elite who make their money in dividends because only the biggest of businesses can mine the moon. It's free market for the whole universe. Literally. But to be fair, this wasn't the Trump administration's idea. Congress makes U.S. laws, and in the 114th Congress in 2015, that Republican-dominated, business-captured nightmare of a Congress wrote the Space Act, which Obama signed into law. And that law makes it crystal clear that, quote, U.S. citizens, unquote, so corporations, can, quote, engage in the commercial exploration and exploitation of space resources, unquote, and it gives them the right to own, transport, and sell whatever they collect there. And for what it's worth, most of the Democrats voted against that bill in the House, but it passed by unanimous consent in the Senate, that process that I told you about in the proxy voting episode, where if no one objects, a bill can just pass an empty room. But these hearings have really changed the way I am hearing the Trump administration officials when they spout off about China. Because we know everything is always all about the money. And the money is in the minerals. And we are so late to that game. We're late to the clean energy game because our government has been so devoted to fossil fuels for so long. We're late to the electric car game for sure. I can't even find car chargers in liberal-ass Berkeley, for Christ's sake. And I was just in Europe in October. On all this stuff, they're so far ahead of us. And so instead of crafting policies that help create actual U.S. businesses that can help us catch up, we're reacting with hostility and aggression towards the country that's winning the race and winning outside of the supposed-to-be global rules that the multinationals wrote. And the Trump administration's aggression has been ramped up big time during the COVID months, which is dumb and dangerous considering we're still dependent on China for about half of our medical supplies. And what's worse is our allies are not with us on this. Countries that have been our partners in the world trade system are dependent on China too, and they don't seem to mind it that much. China is not trying to get everyone to change their economic laws to match China's. Changing everyone else is not their game. They want contracts for their government-involved businesses, and our partners are signing those contracts voluntarily. And the Trump administration, they talk a big game, but they know they've isolated us. Here's Mike Pompeo.
So we can't face this challenge alone. The United Nations, NATO, the G7 countries, the G20, our combined economic, diplomatic, and military power is surely enough to meet this challenge if we direct it clearly and with great courage. Maybe it's time for a new grouping of like-minded nations, a new alliance of democracies. We have the tools. I know we can do it. Now we need the will.
A new alliance. We've spent 70 years creating a global order that we've been at the center of, and it's been trashed after just 3 years of Trump. And so now we need new alliances. But the fact of the matter is we don't have them. And so as we look at this next election, which is now less than 100 days away, we have to acknowledge that we're serving the market economy no matter who we elect as president. Pompeo, who is clearly in charge of the Trump foreign policy. I mean, out of all the people that Trump picked to run his administration in the very beginning, Pompeo's the only guy still there. And he still wants world order that frees the corporations from laws, but he wants to enact it a different way, a strongman kind of way, with different partners. And we don't know who those are. But Joe Biden is a classic post-World War II world trade system, world order kind of guy. And so this presidential election, in as far as, this global order is concerned, is really about, which direction we want our free market fundamentalism to go. There's no option for getting out of it. If we elect Trump again, we're getting the Pompeo direction, which is a path without many friends to back us up. at least Joe Biden and the Democrats, who do have a clean energy plan, aren't hell-bent on an us against the world strategy. And since we're stuck with a corporate government regardless, the least they can do is make sure our companies are operating on the same planet as all the others. But corporate government either way in the law enforcement branch means that if we want to get that power in check, it has to be Congress that acts as that check. Congress has to be the resistance, but for real. Because Mitch McConnell used the entire Trump administration to pack the judicial system with corporate mole judges. It's really quite horrific how effective he's been in that. And so Congress, there's 3 branches of the federal government, 2 are captured by the corporatists, and so we got 1 left, kids. And in less than 100 days, we have the opportunity to replace every single person in the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate. And boy, I would love to see a cleaning out of Congress. Just a huge wave of longtime incumbents gone. Because the House controls all of our tax money. It has the war declaration powers, which have been shelved for entirely too long. It has immense investigative powers that are not being used effectively by the people operating in the House and Senate right now. Subpoenas are defied. It's fine. They do nothing. Then they get people like Attorney General William Barr, who was literally standing there when peaceful protesters were attacked with pepper balls and tear gas and batons. It was live on television. That guy testified this week, and the members of Congress talked more than he did. They gave him lectures instead of asking as many questions as they possibly could with their time while he was under oath. The House is too powerful to be left in the care of these people. They're wasting Congress's power. And when I say these people, I mean about 520 of the 535 individuals in this Congress, especially the ones who have been there the longest because they've established the norms. The rules of behavior, that's the root of all our problems in Congress. And they think, like unanimous consent and proxy voting and allowing subpoenas to be defied and lobbyists roaming the halls and campaign contributions, all of the behaviors that have given us rage bubbles in our souls, they think those behaviors are okay. And I am convinced that if we enacted a mass firing of Congress, things would change for the better. They'd have to, just by sending the message that we're watching and their norms are not okay. It's a non-violent, physically possible action that could cause a major, major power shift, a changing of who controls the money in the federal government. It's removal from office powers. It's a step that would change everything by depowering those who have failed us so miserably during my lifetime. But it requires us watching Congress. And every time this show onboards another producer, I know someone else is watching. And it gives me hope that maybe someday Fire Them All can go viral because it's the best power play that us peasants have. And our next opportunity is so soon. But yeah, I feel like I learned a lot about the global economic game by producing this episode. Even though I live with a solar power engineer, I hadn't given minerals as much thought as I should have. But listening to the way that they're discussed in Congress, they're a really big deal. And there's so many opportunities there for a better economy, a better world. I'd like to have a government focused on building our industry as opposed to knocking China's down on our own. It's just not a fight we're going to win. And so if you got value from hearing these clips or hearing this perspective, which I'm sure is different from what you're hearing just about everywhere else, please join the ranks of the Congressional Dish producers by donating whatever you think is fair. Any number above $0 works for me, using the links in the show notes on your app or at congressionaldish.com. And today, before I wrap up this episode, I would like to thank our first official executive producer, Mike Coverdale. And I will be honest in that I am ripping this idea right off of the business model used by John C. Dvorak and Adam Curry on No Agenda, but I know I have their blessing to do so. We're all buds. But, in the movie or TV business, the executive producer is often someone who has raised a significant portion of a show's production costs. And there is a level of payment that fits that definition of Congressional Dish. And I've actually been trying to figure out for many months now what an appropriate number for executive producer credits would be. And Mike just accidentally nailed it. This week, he sent in $535, which he said is, quote, $1 for every member of the House and Senate, more than most are worth, unquote. And when I saw that, I just went, yes, that's it. $535 really does pay a significant portion of my production costs for one episode. It's not all of it, and I'm sure the costs will continue to climb, but it's significant enough to say that you've financed an episode. It's legit true. And it feels fair to me because that cost isn't out of reach for most people, and I don't want to price anybody out. You know, even in my empty bank account waitressing days, a few weeks of less bar hopping and I could have collected that much. And so I don't feel like it's too high to be discriminatory. And because these are real producer credits, and because my accountant-dominated family created an accounting system for their beloved black sheep, and we can now accurately verify all donations we've received since 2019, well, we will verify executive producers who want to list their executive producer credits on IMDb or LinkedIn or your website or your resume, whatever you want. If someone gets a hold of myself or Lauren to check, we will answer exactly and truthfully about your producer credits. And as for which episode you can executive produce, since I don't plan show topics ahead of time, and I'm sure you want to control, what you put your name on, well, you can pick which episode you want to list as the one you executive produced. So for example, Mike Venmo'd me $535 after the proxy voting episode, but I'm announcing his producer credit on this episode because I'm not Marty McFly. I can't just DeLorean into the future to know who will produce each topic and then go back in time to do the credits on those episodes. It's just not how this works. And so you can back produce. So was the Fed episode your favorite? Executive produce that one. Did surprise medical bills save you a few $1,000 like it did for some of our existing producers? Executive produce that episode. You choose. And feel free to send in a note, of course, telling everyone which episode you produced and why, if you want, and we'll list you as an executive producer in that episode's show notes on congressionaldish.com. And also, because I know we have a lot of people that contribute on a monthly basis, this is cumulative, going back to the beginning of this Congress. And so the starting date for all this is January 1st, 2019. And so let's say you've contributed $25 a month or more since then. Well, you already have a credit. So Chris Simpson, I know you've already racked up a few credits if you want them. But if you're producing at a lower level, keep track and let us know when you get there. We'll verify it and give you your episode credit. And you can executive produce as many episodes as you'd like. In fact, please do. And all producers at every level of funding are still going to be thanked. Obviously, that's what the thank you episodes are for. But executive producers will get main episode recognition. And so here's what Mike wanted to tell the community along with his $535 donation. Mike's note said, quote, I pledge to send you $10 for every Republican replaced by a Democrat, $25 for every corporate Democrat replaced by a progressive, $100 for every third-party win, and $500 each if Pelosi and or McConnell get the axe. And Mike, as if I needed a reason to want those things more. And so thank you, Mike, for your continued support of this show and community and for nailing the perfect number for the credits. $1 for every member of Congress. I love it. And we love having you on the team. And so if you want to pick an episode for your credit, please let us know. And if you'd like to get on the production team, again, you can find the links to all of the payment options in every episode's show notes, either in your app or on congressionaldish.com. Because if you support this work, the ideas behind how it operates, the information in it, or just that it exists, you can be a part of this. You are welcome and you are wanted. And so thanks for listening. Let's see. So the next episode, since the next COVID response law still isn't done, despite the 4 months that they had to do it, it's looking like I'm very likely to do an episode on the hearing that took place this week with our modern day monopolists from Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple. Because I'm so excited to watch that hearing. And I've been reading Matt Stoller's book, Goliath, about antitrust laws in the U.S. going back to the beginning of the last century. I'm loving this book. I think anyone who likes my show would like it too. And then I also have David Dian's new book, Monopolized, on deck. And so I'm super into this topic. This hearing is so right where I'm at right now. And plus, I know you want the highlights of the Zuckerberg, Bezos, and other oligarchs hearing, but you don't want to watch a 5-hour hearing just for the good stuff. And so I'll do it for you. But I don't think that it's going to take me too long to turn that episode around because I'm so into it right now while we, wait for the COVID law that may or may not ever come. But until you hear from me again, good luck, stay sane, and I will talk to you real soon. Thank you, and goodbye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our teeth. We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.